I want you to imagine, just for a second, achieving a monumental, like absolute history-making first in American history.
Right.
You break a barrier that literally no one like you has ever broken before. You spend your entire life in service to others, working in active war zones, impoverished neighborhoods, changing countless
Yeah,
lives.
doing the really heavy lifting.
Exactly. And then, at the end of it all, you pass away, and you are buried in a completely unmarked grave. No name, no dates, nothing.
It's honestly hard to wrap your head around.
It is. You just remain there, effectively erased from the physical record for 125 years.
Which really forces a hard look at how history is actually recorded,
Yeah.
you know? I mean, we tend to operate under this assumption that history automatically acts as a meritocracy.
Yeah.
Like it naturally remembers its pioneers.
Right, like the cream rises to the top.
Exactly. But the reality is that the people who do the heaviest lifting, particularly those operating outside the dominant power structures of their time, they are the ones whose legacies are the most actively marginalized.
Which brings us to the mission of today's deep dive. We are looking at the life of Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler. She was the very first African-American woman to become a doctor of medicine in the United States.
A massive, massive milestone.
Absolutely. And today, we are reconstructing her journey by pulling together surviving historical and biographical records. We're looking at the factual timeline of her life to understand, not just that she broke this barrier, but the specific mechanics of how she did it.
Yeah, how she actually managed to practice medicine in a society that was aggressively hostile to her very existence.
Because it's just so improbable that a story this important could be lost to time. So to understand the mechanics of her success, where do we start?
Well, we really have to start with the shadow medical systems of the early 19th century. So she was born Rebecca Davis in Delaware in 1831, but she was raised in Pennsylvania by her aunt.
Okay, and her aunt was a big influence, right?
Huge influence. The historical context here is critical because professional, institutionally sanctioned medical care was largely inaccessible to Black Americans at this time.
Because of systemic exclusion.
Exactly. So because of that, communities built their own networks of healers. And her aunt was essentially the de facto doctor for their community.
Right. And I think it's important to note, this wasn't just, casually handing out herbal tea.
Oh, no, not at all.
Being a community healer in the 1830s meant you were acting as a pharmacist, a midwife, a triage nurse, and a physician-like all at once.
Yeah, you were the entire healthcare system for your neighborhood.
And Rebecca grew up watching this daily practice. She was witnessing this parallel healthcare system in action from day one.
Which clearly set a massive foundation for her. But she also had a highly unusual level of formal education to pair with that. She attended the West Newton English and Classical School in Massachusetts.
Which was an elite private school, right?
Yeah, very elite. And she enrolled as a special student focusing specifically on mathematics.
See, that mathematical focus is such a crucial detail to me.
Why do you say that?
Well, it indicates a mind trained in really rigorous analytical problem solving. Like, she wasn't just learning rote memorization. She was being trained to identify patterns and apply logical frameworks.
Which is exactly what diagnostics is.
Exactly. When you combine that analytical training with the empathetic, community-based care model she learned from her aunt, you get the exact psychological profile required for a medical pioneer.
That is a great point. And she would absolutely need that resilience quickly because her path was anything but linear.
Right.
So in 1852, she marries Wyatt Lee. He was a formerly enslaved laborer. And Wyatt actually had a 7-year-old son from a previous marriage.
And this is where tragedy really strikes.
Yeah. Tragically, this little boy dies just a year after their wedding.
Oh, wow.
And it's shortly after this really profound personal loss that Rebecca enters the medical field in a much more formal capacity. She spends the next 8 years working as a nurse in Massachusetts.
And we should probably pause and define what nurse actually meant in the 1850s, because I feel like modern listeners might picture, a modern nursing degree.
Right, and it was absolutely nothing like that. Formal nursing schools literally did not exist in the United States yet. The first ones wouldn't even appear until the 1870s.
So it wasn't an academic path at all.
No, not at all. It was this unregulated, grueling apprenticeship. You were learning the raw mechanics of patient care completely on the job under the direct supervision of practicing doctors.
Like just trial by fire.
Exactly. You were dealing with infectious diseases, you were assisting in procedures without modern sanitation, without anesthesia, and managing patient recovery entirely through, like, sheer observation and hands-on practice.
I've been thinking so much about the logistics of that leap. I mean, moving from an informal community caregiver to stepping into the rigid, formal world of academia to become a recognized doctor in the 1800s.
It was basically unheard of.
Right. It wasn't just a matter of studying hard. The institutional gates were firmly locked. A Black woman couldn't just, mail in an application to a medical college and expect it to be reviewed fairly.
Not a chance.
So the mechanism she used to force that door open is just fascinating to me. She essentially weaponized her 8 years of flawless nursing work.
That is exactly how it functioned. She utilized the existing power structure to bypass the institutional gatekeeping.
She used the system against itself.
Right. During those 8 years, the white male doctor she worked under realized her aptitude for medicine was undeniable. I mean, she was practically functioning as a physician already.
Oh.
So she leveraged that reality. She secured letters of recommendation from those specific supervising physicians. And she used their institutional authority to force the New England Female Medical College to admit her in 1859.
It's just a brilliant strategic move. And she even secured state and local scholarships to attend. But I want to contextualize what she was stepping into when she finally walked onto that campus.
Oh, the demographics are staggering.
Yeah. If you look at the 1860 census data for the medical field, it gives you a real sense of the sheer isolation she faced. Out of roughly 54,000 physicians in the entire United States.
54,000.
Yeah. Out of all of them, there were only about 270 white women. There were roughly 180 Black men. And there were 0 Black women.
0. She was literally a demographic anomaly of 1.
Yeah.
The environment she entered was completely uncharted territory. And to compound the intense pressure of being the sole representative of her race and gender in this institution, the country itself was fracturing.
Right, the Civil War.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The impending Civil War was creating this desperate, overarching need for medical professionals.
Right.
Which honestly is the only reason the medical establishment was even slightly willing to entertain the idea of female physicians.
Right. They just needed bodies to treat the wounded. And while she is navigating this incredibly hostile academic environment, analyzing complex anatomy and pathology, her personal life is hit by tragedy again.
It really is.
In 1863, while she is still actively a student, her husband Wyatt dies of tuberculosis.
The psychological endurance required to continue under those circumstances is just staggering. I mean, tuberculosis was a devastating, lingering illness.
It wasn't quick.
No, it was agonizing. And she was likely utilizing all of her medical training to care for him at home while simultaneously preparing for the rigorous oral medical exams required to graduate.
I see this point in her life almost like a structural engineering problem. Getting through medical school in the 1860s as a Black woman wasn't just carrying a heavy burden. It's like trying to run a marathon while carrying boulders, right?
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
You're trying to build a complex suspension bridge while the local establishment is actively dismantling your scaffolding and rewriting the laws of physics to ensure you fail.
And we see that institutional sabotage very clearly when it comes time for her to actually graduate.
Right, she does everything she's supposed to do. She completes 3 years of coursework, she writes her thesis, she passes the oral exams.
But the faculty actively hesitates to grant her the MD in 1864.
Which is just infuriating. What was their justification?
Well, their hesitation is a textbook example of systemic bias operating under the guise of academic rigor.
Right. They couldn't just say they didn't want a Black woman getting the degree.
Exactly. They didn't point to failed exams or actual errors. They used these vague, subjective metrics, claiming her progress was, quote, too slow.
Too slow?
Yeah. They were evaluating her through a lens of deep-seated prejudice, actively searching for administrative technicalities to deny her the degree she had already earned.
But they couldn't make it stick because, again, the physicians she had apprenticed under intervened.
Yep, the same network she built as a nurse.
They essentially had to present the faculty with objective, empirical data of her success in the field, overriding the subjective bias of the instructors. She forces them to acknowledge her undeniable competence, and she officially earns her MD.
Which is an incredible victory. But earning the degree was just the historic milestone. Actually applying it in the real world was an entirely different logistical nightmare.
Especially where she decided to go.
Right. Because when the Civil War ends, she makes a highly calculated and incredibly dangerous decision. She chooses to move down to Richmond, Virginia, to work in coordination with the Freedmen's Bureau.
Richmond in 1865. I mean, that was the ruined capital of the former Confederacy. It was a city completely decimated by war, and it was suddenly flooded with a population of roughly 30,000 newly freed men and women.
30,000 people who had nothing.
Exactly. These were people transitioning out of chattel slavery, arriving in contraband camps with zero infrastructure. They were suffering from exposure, malnutrition, infectious diseases.
And this humanitarian crisis was being intentionally exacerbated by the local medical establishment.
Well, so?
Well, white doctors in the South were systematically denying treatment to this newly freed population. It was essentially a form of political retaliation enacted through the denial of health care. So Dr. Crumpler walked directly into this void to provide care to a population that the establishment was completely content to let perish.
And the establishment actively tried to stop her from doing even that. She faced a literal blockade of intense racism and sexism.
Yeah, it was relentless.
Local pharmacists flat out refused to fill the prescriptions she wrote. The male doctors completely ignored her diagnoses. But I want to dig into the logic they used to justify this, because they didn't just say, we hate you. They leaned on institutionalized pseudoscience, didn't they?
They did. This is a critical mechanism of 19th century medical gatekeeping. The male medical establishment utilized practices like craniometry and phrenology.
Which is the false study of skull shapes, right?
Exactly. It's the completely false, racially motivated study of skull size and shape. But they weaponized this fake science, teaching it in medical schools as objective fact, to falsely claim that women and black people were biologically and intellectually inferior.
So they use this pseudoscientific framework to legally and professionally invalidate her authority.
Precisely. They used it to justify locking her out.
But I have to push back hard against the internal logic of those male doctors. I mean, if they genuinely believed this pseudoscience, if they truly thought she was intellectually inferior and incapable of practicing medicine, they wouldn't have perceived her as a threat at all.
Right. They would have just laughed her off.
Exactly. They would have just ignored her. The fact that they actively organized to sabotage her, that pharmacists coordinated to lock her out of the medical supply chain, proves they knew exactly how highly competent she was.
Oh, absolutely.
You don't blockade a failure. You blockade a threat to your monopoly. They were so threatened they even resorted to petty heckling, claiming the MD after her name stood for mule driver.
Which just shows you how incredibly fragile the egos of the male establishment must have been, attacking a woman who was just trying to provide charity care. But your analysis is spot on. The intense coordination of the sabotage reveals their awareness of her skill.
But it raises a huge logistical question. How do you actually practice medicine if the local pharmacists are actively cutting off your supply chain?
It's a great question. And the answer is that Dr. Crumpler circumvented the pharmacists entirely by reverting back to those shadow medical networks and the 8 years of intensive nursing skills she possessed.
Because if a pharmacist won't give you a pharmaceutical intervention, you have to focus on what you can actually control.
Precisely. If you cannot access the chemicals to treat dysentery or cholera, your medical practice has to shift aggressively to prevention.
Wow. So she adapted.
She had to. She focused on rigorous sanitation protocols, quarantine measures, nutritional support, and symptom management. She was basically utilizing holistic and environmental medicine to keep her patients alive, completely bypassing the traditional hostile supply chains that were trying to freeze her out.
It's just an incredible display of tactical resourcefulness. But the systemic roadblocks of the post-war South were intentionally suffocating. And after navigating that grueling environment, she eventually decides to return north to create a more sustainable practice.
Right back to Massachusetts.
Yeah, she settles in Boston, and it's here that she finds a new partnership. In 1865, she marries Arthur Crumpler. And Arthur's life is a masterclass in defying the odds in its own right.
Oh, Arthur's backstory is unbelievable. He was a formerly enslaved man who essentially secured his survival through physical dominance and strategic timing.
I love this story.
It's wild. The historical accounts tell us that on the day of an estate auction, where he and his family were facing the auction block, he actually got into and won a wrestling match against the son of his enslaver.
On the day of the auction?
Yeah. And he leveraged the ensuing chaos from that match to escape bondage. He successfully navigated his way to Union lines, where he ultimately served as a blacksmith for the Union Army.
So you have these two incredibly formidable, resilient people building a life together. They settle in the Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston, which was this huge hub of abolitionist and intellectual activity.
A much safer environment for them.
Definitely. And she establishes a practice focused squarely on treating poor women and children, often regardless of their ability to pay.
Which tracks perfectly with her entire career ethos.
Right. But she realizes that treating one patient at a time just isn't enough to enact structural change. She needs to scale her knowledge. So in 1883, she takes the medical notes she's been compiling over her entire career and publishes a Book of Medical Discourses.
And this publication, I mean, it cannot be overstated in its importance. It is heavily focused on pediatric and maternal care.
Why that specific focus?
Well, she targeted this demographic intentionally because in the 19th century, mothers were the frontline healthcare workers of the home.
Oh, that makes sense.
By educating mothers on the mechanics of the human body, she was decentralizing medical knowledge. Her primary focus was on preventative medicine, understanding the environmental and dietary triggers of disease to stop illnesses before a doctor was even required.
Which is amazing because when you look at the healthcare system today and you see modern holistic platforms where practitioners emphasize lifestyle factors, dietary interventions, and environmental stressors alongside traditional medicine, you are looking at the exact framework she was pioneering in 1883.
Exactly. She was way ahead of her time.
She was telling her readers that their daily habits were intrinsically linked to their physiological health. But beyond the medical advice, there is a structural detail about this book that is incredibly radical for the time period.
You're referring to the preface.
Yes. Can you break down the historical weight of that for us?
Absolutely. So in the late 19th century, it was standard practice and essentially an unspoken publishing requirement for Black authors to have a prominent white male figure write the introduction to their books.
Like a permission slip.
Exactly. It was a mechanism of authentication. The white author was signaling to the white public that the text was legitimate.
Right.
But Dr. Crumpler refused to play that game. She wrote her own introduction.
Which is just a massive flex.
It really was. It was this quiet but absolute rejection of the era's racial hierarchy. By authoring her own preface, she was declaring that her authority did not require external validation from a white man.
She just claimed her space.
Yeah, she wove in autobiographical details outlining her years of practical nursing, her formal medical degree, and her decades of frontline experience.
She laid out the receipts.
Exactly. She was communicating directly to her readers, stating unequivocally that her lived experience and empirical results were all the authentication her knowledge required. She claimed total ownership of her intellectual property.
It's a definitive statement of autonomy. So, having achieved all of this, how does the final chapter of this pioneer's life unfold?
Well, her later years were characterized by a deep, continued embedding within her community. She and Arthur eventually moved from Beacon Hill to Hyde Park, Massachusetts.
Did she keep practicing?
She remained very engaged in civic and intellectual life. As just one example of her community presence, she actually read an original poem at the funeral service of Senator Charles Sumner, who was a notoriously staunch abolitionist.
Wow, that's a huge honor.
It was. She lived a life defined by quiet, persistent service until her passing in 1895. And Arthur survived her by 15 years, passing away in 1910.
Which brings us back to the stark reality we opened this deep dive with. Despite breaking one of the most rigidly guarded barriers in American history, despite navigating war zones to treat the most marginalized populations, and despite publishing a foundational text on preventative care, when Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler and her husband died, they were buried in Fairview Cemetery in Boston, in graves with no markers.
It is a sobering physical manifestation of how the medical establishment, and really society at large, attempted to erase her. I mean, for 125 years, the gravesite of the very first Black female physician in America was literally nothing but grass.
It's heartbreaking. But the historical record, thankfully, is subject to revision.
It is.
In 2020, a grassroots fundraising campaign was organized to correct this specific historical failure. People from all over the country contributed, and the Crumplers were finally provided with the engraved granite headstones that their legacy demanded.
It's a really powerful reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past. You know, it is an active, ongoing process of remembering and correcting.
Absolutely.
And today, her name is finally integrated into the institutional memory she fought so incredibly hard to enter. There are pre-health societies named in her honor at major universities, and her former home in Beacon Hill is a recognized stop on the Boston Women's Heritage Trail.
Her legacy is finally cemented, both literally and figuratively. But learning the mechanics of her erasure and eventual rediscovery leaves a really profound question for all of you listening today.
It really does.
If a pioneer of this magnitude, someone who fundamentally altered the landscape of American medicine, could rest anonymously under our feet in an unmarked grave for over a century, what other world-changing histories are out there? What other architects of our modern systems are buried in your own local cemeteries without a name, just waiting for someone curious enough to start digging?